Okay, good morning, everyone. We'll give one more minute to let people continue to come in from the waiting room, and then we'll get started. Okay, in the interest of time, let's go ahead and get started. I see folks are still joining, but we'll bring them in as they come online. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this second webinar in our 2022 Fall Winter Science Seminar Series, brought to you by the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, also known as SE CASC or Southeast CASC. You'll probably hear those along the way here. So my name is Carrie Furness, and I'm the Assistant University Director here at the Southeast CASC. So I'm joined today by Kristen Fontana, a Science Communication Fellow with us as well. So in these virtual seminars, we're highlighting CCASC funded projects that support resource management actions across the Southeast, and we're going to hear about an exciting new network that's being developed in our region. So let me start with letting you know what to expect from today's webinar. So first we'll go over some of the meeting logistics, request some quick feedback via poll, and then we'll introduce our speakers for today. So they'll present for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion at the end before we wrap up. So now Kristen will give you a quick overview of our webinar technology, emphasis on quick because we all know how to do this by now, I guess. Go ahead, Kristen.
Hi, yeah, I'm just going to quickly cover some of these Zoom basics. As Carrie mentioned, we're sure that you're all pretty well versed in Zoom by now. So I'm just going to point out a few things. The controls on the bottom left of your screen have mute and start video. We ask that you do keep your video off and your voice muted so that we can reduce distractions during the presentations. In the middle of the bottom bar, you can access the chat window, and we encourage you, if you have questions, to submit them in the chat for discussion after the talks. We'll be monitoring questions there, and we'll pose them to our speaker during the Q&A session after they present. We'll also be recording this webinar today, and you can access them on our website, on the Southeast CASC website, on our Science Seminar Series page, and on our YouTube channel. We're going to just launch a quick poll just to get a little bit of information about who's with us today and help us figure out how to get information about these future seminars. So I'm just going to give you about a half a minute or so to fill this out. I'm going to end the poll now, and I'll share the results here. So thank you everyone for filling this out and for feeding back this information. It's great to see the breadth of folks in our audience today, which sets us up for a robust discussion about this research. Now we'll turn it over to our presentation. While we switch screen sharing, Carrie will introduce our speakers.
So we have three speakers today who will talk about the Southeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network. First up will be Wesley Daniel, right? Who's a supervisory fisheries biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey at the Wetland and Aquatic Research Center in Gainesville, Florida. He's also coordinator for the Non-Indigenous Aquatic Species Database. Next, we'll have Dr. Deah Lieurance, who's an extension scientist in the agronomy department at the University of Florida and coordinator of the University of Florida IFAS, I'll let her define that, assessment of non-native plants in Florida's natural areas. And then Dr. Brett Scheffers will bring it home with this presentation, and he's a global change ecologist in the Wildlife Ecology and Conservation Department at the University of Florida. So they're going to give us a bit about the creation of the Southeast RISCC, which was established earlier this year and joins a national network of risk networks in the Pacific Islands, Northwest, North Central, and Northeast. So go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you, Carrie, for giving this opportunity to present about the Southeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Network, or Southeast RISCC. And so why are we here? Well, the Southeast U.S. harbors thousands of invasive plants and animals which have been purposely introduced through the pet trade and organisms trade, and through accidental introductions through commercial trade. Many of these invasive species have relatively restricted ranges right now during our current climate, especially within Southeast Florida. But as climate changes, these species are expected to expand their ranges and potentially open up new habitat for other invasives that are not here currently. So to plan and to respond to this redistribution of invasive species, we need researchers, managers, policymakers, and the general public to coordinate with the existing information we have, as well as identify information needs for the future. Next slide. So what we want to cover today is thinking about the influence of climate change on invasive species. And we want to kind of provide that in an overview of this new network that we're building out. What's our mission, how we want to organize this network, and where are the goals, including development of products. We want to highlight some survey work we've done looking towards what managers and researchers say are high priority for them within the Southeast. And then look across the broader risk network. As Carrie said, this is just one of many regional groups working to these goals. And then finally explain how the research from the Southeast US and invasive climate work is important. We have a lot of great work going on, and how you can contribute at the end to the Southeast RISCC. Next slide. So this is the founder team, and then all three of us will be presenting today. We are a wonderful complement to each other because we have a wide breadth of experience within research, academia, and the invasive world. Brett is a field ecologist, has done a lot of work both in North America and Central and South America. He's got the research really component as part of his university position. Myself, I'm an agency member. I run a database. I think a lot about large data and potential movement of species. And then Deah is an extension focused, and she thinks a lot about risk. And so there's a lot of wonderful complements to the three of us in starting up this network. Next slide, please. So if you watch other risk groups, they're all going to say this, but it's really true for us. We're fairly unique, and climate change is going to impact the Southeast in ways that may not in other areas. With these warming temperatures over time, we expect to see lots of both weather pattern changes and disruption, which is going to influence, a lot of the ways that we work in our ecosystems, both structure and function. In the Southeast, we're really concerned, obviously, about sea level rise. As oceans are going to soak up most of the heat from warming temperatures, we're going to see higher melting of ice sheets. It's going to raise sea levels and threaten our coastal and island communities, with Florida being one of the potential areas with the most loss of landmass. Fire dynamics will also change with the changes in temperature and seasonal rain events. We're going to see resulting in higher potential drought alteration and those fire dynamics changing within the region. Extreme weather, we've been talking about for years. We're going to see potentially more frequent and more severe weather, both in storms and in hurricanes, something the Southeast deals with annually. And then potentially increases in urbanization and human land use as climate change increases factors that influence human migration, potentially water scarcity or movement of peoples within North America. We could see a boom within the Southeast where some of these resources are very plentiful. Next slide, please. So when thinking towards our biological invasions within the region and in the greater US, this is generally the process we look towards. And climate change will have a distinct influence on these steps when thinking about transportation, introduction, the potential establishment of an exotic or non-native species, spread, and then its impacts. And just starting off with transportation, we're going to see potentially new avenues, new pathways for introduction as new shipping routes through the Pantarctic open up through ice melt. We're also going to see potential changes in spread rates as those warmer climates, go ahead and hit it, Deah. Thank you. Those warmer climates allow some of our species that right now are thermally limited to move further north to spread into new regions. Here's an example of Brazilian pepper tree and its potential movement with tropicalization of the Southeast. And finally, we could see new impacts as some of the consequences of these both climate and invasive interactions become more evident. And so here's an example of how both drought and the bark beetle have led to higher fire risk. Next slide, please. And so here are some examples of consequences of climate change for invasive species as laid out by Hellman in the 2011 paper. We're going to see altered distribution of the existing invasive species that are currently established within the Southeast, altered transportation and introduction mechanisms, potential establishment of new invasives as temperatures change and new habitats might become available to them. Altering the impacts also, things that are here that maybe are unimpactful or less conspicuous or what might come up as being more problematic, and altered effectiveness of our control strategies. Next slide, please. So this is kind of our goal statement here. The Southeast Risk Management Network, we're striving to reduce the joint effects of both climate change and invasive species by really working together, by synthesizing relevant science, sharing the needs and knowledge of managers, building that stronger science manager communities, and conducting priority research. Next slide, please. The way that we feel like we're going to build our network is a hierarchical relationship. So we have the founding members, which are the three presenters today. We want to build out an advisory board, which we're currently recruiting for, though we can seek out for decision making. Within there, we're going to develop a core leadership team. And this will be the team that really is in the trenches helping us do a lot of the work of the Southeast RISC. They'll be meeting regularly, helping us develop products, conducting research, working on towards workshops, and participating in the cross-risk network. But then there's a greater network comprised of all stakeholders and users that have interest. And these are managers or researchers, policymakers that just have any vested interest in climate change and invasive species. And you can be involved at any level of this network, including a workshop, which we'll talk more about in the near few slides, that we'll be hosting in Gainesville to really look towards the objectives where we want to really move this first couple years with the network. Next slide, please. So we're already producing some products. If you're part of our mailing list, you've received this research summaries. We're going to continue this into the future, summarizing relevant new research from the Southeast and broader that would be of interest. We're also, next slide, we'll click it, please. We're also going to start developing some management challenge information. We've not developed one yet. This one's an example from the Northwest, but we see that as a nice guide, and we'd like to follow suit with similar thinking about potential current threats and to management. And thank you. And we're also holding a webinar series, which we've already had several wonderful researchers and managers present on their current research and their products, and we'll be continuing this into the future. And finally, we have a Twitter account. So if you are interested in following us and any kind of updates we have. Deah?
All right, now I'm going to take over and talk to you about some other aspects of some of the work that we've been doing. First and foremost, we wanted to sort of take a pulse on our stakeholders, the folks that we want to bring into this network. And like the other risk networks, we put out a manager and a researcher survey with the objective to understand the barriers to management success, particularly those stemming from knowledge gaps between research and practice. And so other goals, we wanted to determine how they are considering intersection of climate change and invasive species, determine the needs, opportunities, and limitations faced by managers in the region, and then finally provide important information to help build collaborative relationships between these groups to really target and address these challenges posed by climate change and biological invasions. And so here's some of the results. The manager's survey, we had 162 responses. We distributed this over Twitter through different regional and national and state networks, listservs. and somewhat through word of mouth. But you do see here that we did have a pretty big bias to Florida. So over 50% of our respondents were from Florida. And this could be, based on the reach, or conversely, we just have so much going on in Florida. We have a lot of people who are engaged and willing to share that information. I would argue the former, and we're going to work to try to expand in future surveys to get a more even response from across the region. But we asked the respondents to identify their management priorities. And here you can see that biodiversity and threatened and endangered species were some of the big management priorities across this community. But also there were quite a few responses for forest resources and habitat connectivity. In terms of priority research topics, so this is the managers asking, indicating what research they would like to see to help them do their work, basically. And so you've got low priority, medium priority, and high priority is in this purple. And what they indicated was that range shifting species and hotspots and resilient native communities are of their priority interests. This is the information they'd like to get so they can, transfer that into actual management. We also asked to list the invasive species, like the top 3 species of invasive species they feel pose the greatest threat currently. And here this does show a bit of that Florida bias. Kogan grass was the biggest one. That is a regional problem, but Brazilian pepper tree is shyness, and Lygodium is the climbing ferns, both Japanese and Old World. But you see some other stuff poking around in here, but notably the 3 most concerning are plants. And then in the future, so asking the same question, what do you think is going to be a problem in 5 to 10 years? Again, these 3 pop to the surface, but we also see ligustrum here, which is your privets, feral. This was tied to both feral hogs and feral cats. Moving to the researcher survey, you can see a little more parity here. So only 19% from Florida. We did get a really nice spread across the region, including some responses from Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. We asked to identify their research priorities, and here you see ecological impacts, general community ecology, and range and distribution of invasive species were the prominent responses, as well as biodiversity, which was shared with the manager community, but not as much of a showing for this threatened and endangered species. As for priority research topics, this is what the researchers are the most interested in. So you see a lot of responses for this range shifting species and hotspots, which was a nice overlap with what the managers were asking for. But there's also this changes in impacts due to climate change and the resilient native communities, which wasn't quite as high, but we did have overlap again with those managers, which is encouraging. Same question to the researchers. You see some species coming out. You've got our Kogan grass again. EAB is emerald ash borer. Privet is that ligustrum, and woolly adelgid. But you can see there's just a whole bunch of different, a lot of different species by the size of the word. You can see in this cloud that a lot of stuff is pretty equal, and we have a lot more diversity of concern. In the future, here we see that woolly adelgid again is the ALB. Kogan grass is very prominent. And unknown, this really struck me that the researchers' response was that unknown was, they were answering things like, I don't even want to think about it. And it's hard to tell. So this is something that, really sort of nods towards thinking about, prevention, identifying things before they become a problem. So maybe, some risk assessment and horizon scanning activities there could help sort of identify this unknown. Just want to point out that Southeast RISCC, we keep mentioning the cross risk. We are part of a larger network. So we are the newest group Northeast RISCC, we call them the OGs. They sort of developed this kind of network and created a lot of the structure that the other groups are following. So we kind of do our own thing to a certain extent, but we have some common products, some of those products that Wes highlighted a few slides ago. But we do have North Central, Northwest, the Pacific Islands, of course, us. And the last I heard, we do have some folks working on starting a Midwest. The ultimate goal is to cover the whole United States. And actually, we've had through some other work through NASMA, there are some folks up in Canada that are wanting to create similar networks. So there might be some cross national boundary work to be done. And this is the landing page for the networks that do exist. I do want to point out the Southeast website is basically kind of a placeholder right now. We are in development. We're working with very generous Chuck Bargeron is creating our website for us. And we should have an updated website soon. Chuck was also, very helpful in setting up our listserv. So I want to pivot to some cross-risk work that we did. Just a few weeks ago, we had the NASMA conference. So that's if you're not familiar, it's the North American Invasive Species Management Association. And we wanted to, the meeting, we wanted to organize this cross-risk workshop. We had representatives from all the risks that were in existence. And we wanted to really set it up to where we could engage the community and collect some information across for maybe some national efforts. However, Hurricane Nicole, I'm calling this the Hurricane Nicole pivot. So if you aren't familiar with this, the NASMA conference originally was going to be in Fort Myers at that time. And about 6 weeks before the conference, Hurricane Ian took out our venue in Fort Myers. So we were able to secure another venue only to be hit by another hurricane. So Nicole was a direct hit on the venue. So a lot of us had to leave. Like I had to go home and take care of my house. A lot of the agency folks were deployed, or they had to go to, were instructed if they had state vehicles, they had to go home. So what was kind of funny about the whole thing, the folks that were left were largely not from Florida. There were only a few Florida people who remained. So the folks that were still there, they rallied and they put together pivot is the right word, over the same kind of structure, but maybe a little pared down because of the audience. So 50 people were there for the introductory presentations, and about 35 stayed for discussion. We started with presentations from the Pacific, the Northwest, and North Central risks, and then followed by these discussion prompts. How is climate change affecting your work? What research is needed? What are the management needs? And what might mitigate these issues? And so here's just a few quotes from the conversation. This one is from Sarah Rang from the Invasive Species Center in Sault Ste. Marie, Canada. Being the northern partner, we are seeing a change in our winters, less ice and much warmer. We're seeing a whole raft of new forest pests that are moving into our region. Jenny Hinton from Jacksonville, city of Jacksonville. Climate change is shifting species, both native and invasive. There are many that are opposed to any invasive species, and the movement of native species to new ranges are included for some people, included as a problem. So what do we do with natives that are shifting ranges? This is something that came up a few times. And then final little quote blurb here is from Jen Souls from Arlington, DPR in Virginia. We are seeing our forest structure change. It is looking thicker and denser, which is likely not good, but we need to know, and I would extrapolate on, we need to know more about what's going to happen. So there were some common themes that came out of the discussion. The first sort of set here, shifting ranges of both native and non-native species. So there was a lot of interest in knowing what's going to move, how fast, and how to deal with natives versus non-natives as they shift ranges. Also, the fact that a lot of these regions are seeing a more diverse taxonomic spread of what's coming in, where historically it might have just been plants or a few insects, and now they're seeing all kinds of taxonomic groups, including vertebrates and, you know, your different aquatic species and whatnot. Next, there was a research need identified on how interactions between natives and non-natives will change and what will be the consequences. So kind of getting at that changes in what's going to be there and also what the impacts are going to be in the future. This is probably the most important chunk. This came up over and over again, communication, the word communication. And so the first point here, better communication between invasive species and climate change silos. And by silos, we mean, you know, a lot of times the invasive species community is working in one silo, the climate change scientists are working in another. How do we break down those silos to work together to try to solve some of these problems? Next is better communication with the stakeholders and policymakers. So how do we get that information out in a digestible package so that we can get effective policy set? We can make sure the managers are getting the information they need to control these invasives. And then finally, this is what I think is really bubbling to the top with this workshop and a couple other breakout sessions that I've led, is this request or need for standardized and accessible terminology. And this is something that we are exploring as a cross-risk group as a potential workshop to kind of develop these definitions to get that out there on a national basis. And then, of course, this always comes up, your dedicated continuous funding to be allocated to invasive species management and research. And then finally, build inclusive, diverse working groups, including stakeholders in outreach and decision-making. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Brett.
I'm going to talk about two projects that have been funded by Southeast CASC, but are highly applicable to Southeast RISCC. One is a risk assessment project, as well as a workshop. And the focus of this project today is on the exotic pet trade and its links to invasive species. So historically, most established vertebrates, let's say in Florida, elsewhere, have some links to trade. And there is concern that climate change is going to compound these risks. And a major other compounding factor is that the exotic pet trade in particular is a exploding industry, which is a great thing. I mean, lots of people are getting jobs, and but there's also high levels of associated risk with that. And a complicating factor is that we know very little information about what species are currently traded, and the different routes to market, which can potentially influence invasion risk. Next. So just to kind of provide some structure, there's going to be three questions I'm going to address today. The first is what species are traded in the US. Second is thinking about current and future suitability, climate suitability of the species that are traded. And then third, I'm going to pivot to thinking about propagules. So the idea that individuals get released into the wild, you have a likelihood that multiple individuals meet and then breed and establish a population. So this is an incredibly important factor in invasion ecology, but it's very difficult to tackle. And so I'm going to present on some creative ways that we can try to account for propagules in our estimates of risk. Next. So what species are traded within the US? So this might appear to be kind of a straightforward question, but it's a little bit more complex because we have a lot of information. So if you look on the left of that flow chart, we have a lot of information on species flowing into the United States, right? So we have importation records, we know what species are coming in, but then it's kind of like, well, what happens afterwards? And so I want to just kind of walk through these different pipelines of like entering through to selling to the consumer. So the top one is a single sale or low demand species. This would be like a scenario where some of these species that we know enter the US might be like singletons or just a few individuals where a collector or a single shop might say, hey, this very rare frog from South America, I want it. And they put in an order and they get that frog. Well, that's a relatively low risk scenario. It's the higher demand species. It's the species that enter the US, and especially those that get established in captive breeding programs, which is where that market is developing around, where I said, like, there's this explosion of the exotic pet trade. This is really, it's an industry within the US. These species enter and then they start captively breeding them. These higher demand species break into two different scenarios. One, you have your low medium volume. So, you know, some individuals, a good number, but not a huge number, because they tend to be high value, high cost. And so this is catering to your expert, kind of your collector of exotic pets. And they tend to have a lot more experience because they're high cost. They tend to be better maintained. And so the end result is kind of a low to medium risk scenario with these low, medium volume, high risk species. It's the high volume and low cost species that are potentially problematic because you have lots of species, lots of individuals being sold at relatively low cost. It's catering to a novice pet owner. They tend to be present in your big brick and mortar stores like Petco, PetSmart, et cetera. And this is a potentially high risk scenario just based on the market itself, not putting the ecology traits, et cetera, of the species, just based on sales alone. This is how it kind of breaks down. Next. So thinking about the lower portion, so there's like the higher demand species, there's three routes to market. First is your traditional pet store. Then you have your exotic pet expositions. These are expos that travel around the country, and they tend to cater for breeders that go to these expos to sell what they have in stock. And then you have online pet stores also catering to breeders. And these online pet stores have huge inventories and a good reach. It's a new market, but it is rapidly growing. Next. So our question is, what species are traded within the US? And so we took a three-pronged approach to cover the three routes to market. So if we look at this map, all those tiny purple points are actual brick and mortar stores with a shop that sell exotic pets. What we wanted to do is get a good coverage of brick and mortar stores and pet expos across the country. And so we traveled around the US, visiting brick and mortar stores, inventorying what species are for sale, as well as visiting several pet expos. And then the third is these online stores where we used a variety of algorithms to pull information from big online stores. And the end result here is kind of an inventory of species for sale in the US across the three dominant routes to market. Next. So what did we find? We found a total of about 1,200 species for sale in the US, of which about 990, or well, not about, exactly 995 were non-native to North America. So that means that the other 200 or so species there were native, meaning they had some of their range native to North America. This could be like milk snakes or king snakes, some species of turtle, et cetera, that might be Western species being sold in the East or vice versa. Those non-native species, the 995, what's really interesting here is that they are the epicenters of the trade, of the richness and trade are in the tropics. These are tropical species that are being sold in the United States, which has lots of implications in a few slides for the Southeast US. And if we look taxonomic, that's all right, back real quick. I just want to talk about these pie charts. I thought when I was saying it that I was, apologies. So if we break it down taxonomically, about 60% are reptiles, 20% birds, and then the remaining are amphibians and mammals. And then the prevalence, meaning like the proportion, so it's like the amount of these individuals sold also breaks down by that same taxonomy. So reptiles are dominating the trade in the United States for vertebrates. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we know what species are in the US. The next question is, well, what is the current future climate suitability for these traded species? And we wanted to take a relatively simple and conservative approach here. So I just want to like nail this methodology down so everyone understands what we did. So we have our 995 species. We did not do this for the native North American species, just those that are not native. We went to those non-native species ranges. We extracted the GBIF records, which are occurrence records, and we intersected it with a variety of climate variables, temperature, precipitation. And then in the invading range, North America, we randomly threw out 500 points across the landscape and pulled out the climate variables for those random points. We did this ordination that plots those bioclimatic variables, and if they do not overlap, those species were kicked out. They were removed. However, if there was some overlap between the native and invading range, invading being North America, we then looked at for the native range. So if you look in that lower left corner in that blue, that's the distribution of native range of the climate space. We took the mean and the 1 standard deviation on each side of the mean. And then for those random sample points, we only took the bit that overlaps within 1 standard deviation of the mean. So it's a really conservative approach here. It's that bioclimatic space that we then plotted as suitable habitat within North America. Next, please. Okay, so what did we find? So of those 995 species that we modeled, the current suitability is concentrated in Florida primarily. So you can see on the left, the current suitability, there's medium to high suitability kind of in Florida bleeding into Georgia. We then did this under future climate scenarios. So this is a medium to high emission approach. And what you see is a dramatic increase in future suitability. Florida is ablaze in red, highly suitable. But what's really interesting here is that almost the entire region outside of Appalachia is medium to high suitability. So we expect to see a relatively large increase in climate suitability moving forward under climate change. Next, please. And then our third question was thinking about propagules. So how can we try to incorporate some estimate of propagules into our assessment of risk? And so up to now, we've just been talking about climate suitability. So on that map that you saw, those little purple points, the tiny ones, that's 2,828 brick and mortar stores. So what we did is we generated a buffer, and it was like, well, how far will people travel to go buy a pet from a local store? And we were like, well, I would probably travel 30, 40 minutes. But we were like, well, let's just cut it at 10 kilometers to be conservative. We then overlapped all the brick and mortar stores with this buffer, and it generated essentially kind of a density of stores per unit area. And we use that as an estimate of propagule pressure. So the idea here is the more stores that you find congregated in a given area, those stores exist because there's demand for pets. And so they wouldn't exist if there wasn't demand for pets. So the more stores, the more pet sales, the higher likelihood that propagules will enter the wild, especially from these brick and mortar stores that cater to those higher demand species. So in that little bivariate map, what we have there, that's on the right-hand side with the different colors, we have propagule likelihood on the left and climate suitability on the bottom there. And so if we look at deep purple represents areas with the highest climate suitability combined with the highest propagule likelihood. And you can see that Florida and the Southeast US is under very, very high risk based on these two components. The other area would be Texas and some parts of Louisiana. The blue and the orange, I think, are really interesting because these are kind of estimates of high future risk. It's like latent risk. So the blue are areas where you have high propagule likelihood, but it's climatically not suitable at the moment. And so these areas would be prime for increased risk under climate change. The orange are areas that are really climatically suitable, but maybe there's not a high demand for exotic pets for whatever reason. Here, it would be human population growth, where you might generate demand for species would increase the overall risk for that area. Next, please. So in conclusion, what we actually found was that considering climate change, the impact of climate change on invasion risk, it increases kind of the invasion risk footprint by about 200%. That equates to about 80% of the land area of the United States will be suitable for invasion by 2080, so 60 years from now. So climate change might have a dramatic effect on invasion. We hope that, we think that the pet trade it certainly has been important in the past, and it's going to be important to consider in the future. And this kind of assessment of risk, it's a kind of a necessary step, right? So the pet trade, it's an industry. People have livelihoods connected to the pet trade, but it's important to understand that trade and associated risks in order to kind of have some balance, I guess, and that is essentially preventative action. So that not every species that is sold is risky, but there are certainly some known high-risk species, and so this kind of risk assessment allows for prevention, which is an important part of invasion management. And then lastly, we highlight the Southeast as a kind of an epicenter of invasion risk, Florida being kind of it's kind of like the seed for all invasion in the Southeast. Next slide. Thank you. So Florida, it's ground zero for invasion. And one of the, we were kind of just taking this approach thinking about climate suitability, but there are lots of established species in Florida, and there are problems associated with trying to understand where the species occur and modeling their distribution. And it's slightly theoretical, but then also just, so the theoretical issue is that it's an unfilled niche. And so you have these species that are just establishing populations, but they haven't had time to fully kind of realize their distribution. And so it's difficult to kind of say, where do they occur as well as where might they occur because of that. And then also there's the occurrence records for a lot of these species have a lot of associated biases, and they're just limited. And so trying to use standard distribution model approaches for invasives has always been a challenge. One thing we know though is that there's a lot of managers, state, federal agency biologists, researchers that have huge, just lots of experience in the field, extensive knowledge of these species. And we were wondering maybe if we could tap into this expert knowledge, can we fill some of these information gaps? But the big question is, how do we harness it, and how do we harness it in a standardized way? Next. So we're going to introduce a toolkit or a mapping tool or exercise here. And there were two goals. This was in a workshop format. There were two goals here. Using expert knowledge was, how do we estimate habitat suitability, and spatial prevalence, which is just kind of like thinking about the number of individuals in an area for over a dozen high-risk species in Florida, as well as the surrounding states. And then the second is, once we have this information, how do we use suitability, prevalence, as well as some associated traits like physiology to estimate distribution, then think about how can we use that to model range expansion. as well as thinking about, can we incorporate like some management approaches to assess the effectiveness of management in preventing and slowing spread. Next slide, please. So you could just go all the way through. This is yep, back right there. Perfect. Thank you. So this work here, it was a workshop. It was put on in collaboration with Luke Evans, a postdoc in my lab, Alex Becker, PhD candidate, Josh Cullen, who's currently a postdoc at Florida State University. Wes was also part of this workshop. And essentially what we did is it was a 2-day workshop where we brought in about 30 experts at Austin Cary Forest. In that lower right corner, this would actually be the venue for our Southeast RISCC workshop, which we'll talk about shortly, but in the summer of 23. And anyways, for this workshop, it was, how do we estimate suitability? So we use Shiny app, which is a very kind of, it's a very user-friendly app, a web-based application where we created this app where the user can select the species, and then there are these little sliders with 24 land classifications like deciduous forest, pine uplands, urban, etc. They select their species, and then with the slider, they can assess the relative suitability of each land category for each species. And so again, the nice thing is that it generated this real-time suitability based on what they submit across the 24 land types. And we did this for about a dozen terrestrial species, reptiles, mammals, birds, and amphibians. So we use this to drive a composite. So across all 30 experts, we could then get an average with associated confidence for habitat suitability per species. Next slide, please. We then asked them to derive prevalence. So in this scenario, it was like a little drawing pen where you can literally, by clicking, you can increase or decrease the intensity of the prevalence of this species in the landscape. So it's like almost like a drawing tool where the oranger means it's more prevalent in an area. As you go into the reds and purples, it's less prevalent. And we then asked the experts, choose your species and then indicate the spatial prevalence based on your knowledge of the species and observation where these species might occur. Next slide. So I'm just going to quickly just show some descriptive outputs from this workshop. So this is black and white tegu. It is a species of considerable concern. The spatial prevalence of the species on the left shows that it's concentrated in the Southeast US. But of concern is the habitat suitability on the right. So if it is orange or red, it is highly suitable. And so the entire Southeast US in terms of habitat suitability is high, medium to high suitability. So there's not a lot of habitat barriers to this species. Next, please. Another example, green iguana. This species, it tends to be a coastal, in terms of spatial prevalence, it tends to be most prevalent in coastal regions of South Florida, east and west. And its distribution, that orange and red, coastal areas, it likes urban areas, etc. So next. And then Muscovy duck, we did I think a few birds, but here, Muscovy duck. It is widespread throughout the state of Florida in terms of spatial prevalence. And then if you look on the right in terms of the suitability, it likes wetlands, especially urban areas, owing to stormwater, constructed ponds, etc. Next. And so then we can compile a composite across all the species to just give you a general sense of kind of epicenters of prevalence of invasive species, as well as a composite estimate of suitability. So you can see across these 12 species, high prevalence of these species in South Florida, kind of bleeding a little bit into North Florida. And then in terms of habitat suitability, it's relatively widespread across the region, especially when you move out of Florida into the coastal plains. Next, please. So the utility of these two maps is that, one, they provide the habitat suitability, which we can use as a landscape resistance map in modeling connectivity of landscapes for each individual species. So these two outputs will then be used for more sophisticated modeling. So in order to understand establishment and spread, we can use connectivity models, thinking about landscape resistance, but then with that spatial prevalence, each cell with high prevalence is kind of a seed. It's like, okay, there are individuals here, and then individuals will flow out of this cell into the landscape based on the resistance of the landscape, the connectivity of the landscape, but then also some of the trait information that we got from the experts, such as cold extremes. Physiology is a really important trait that we'll consider, road mortality, as well as removals, which, for example, Florida Fish and Wildlife has a removal program for Burmese pythons. Perhaps other management scenarios will be able to incorporate to get good estimates of establishment and then predict future spread. Next. Okay, so that sums up those two little research projects funded through Southeast CASC, but are applicable to Southeast RISCC. We really want to get folks involved. And so please go ahead and take a photo or scan the QR code in the top right corner. This will allow you to sign up for the listserv, and you can get updates. And some of these updates are on upcoming events. It's on some of those products, such as the research summaries or management challenges documents that we'll be putting out shortly. We started this webinar series. We've had 3 webinars to date. We've had pretty good turnout for these. We've had some great speakers, and it's a range of topics from research to management focus. They're the third Thursday of each month at 1 p.m. Eastern time. Our next one is scheduled January 19th. It's Mike Osland, and he's going to be talking about tropicalization, so community changes under climate change. So please sign up to the listserv. Also, you'll be able to get some information on the upcoming workshop, which is in June of 2023. And this is going to really be an important workshop to be involved with. It's going to be about basically deciding the future direction of the network, but also kind of forging some collaborations and getting some projects moving forward research-wise, as well as identifying management priorities. Next. Okay, so in summary, it's all about building a community. We really hope we're at 108 members. We hope to grow this. And so please join the Southeast Network. If you find today's seminar compelling, I hope you do. So scan that QR code in the top right. And again, we see this as a vehicle for kind of sharing information, getting together and doing some really cool science, connecting with managers and improving effective management. And so please reach out to us. Again, we're in the initial stages. So reach out to either of the 3 of us if you would like to be more involved with the network. Okay, I think that kind of wraps it up. I think we could take some questions.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much. This is an awful lot of great work. So let me spotlight you all so we can have a discussion. So we'll open the floor for folks. Nothing has come through on the chat, so I would say to go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll call on you to ask your question. Let's go ahead and take it. Looks like there's a questions coming in the chat. So did you include fish and crayfish in your analyses?
No, we did not, but we should have.
All right.
Yeah, that would be really exciting to do.
Great. So next, does policy factor into the Southeast RISC's mission, and if so, how?
I'll take this. In terms of policy, the policy doesn't, I wouldn't say that it factors into, the mission, but how to answer this, but we're trying to bring in folks who, that's the idea of having the managers, the researchers, the extension folks, and the policymakers, so that we can all sort of intercommunicate and hopefully influence climate smart policy in the future.
Okay, any follow-up to that, Emily? Okay, great. So are there any chapters or species of special concern in North Carolina in particular? I guess by chapters, Dawn, you mean chapters of the Southeast or of risk councils, or you could clarify. Oh yeah, chapter of risk. Okay.
Right now it's just us here in Florida. I think the idea is not to really, we're going to provide the structure, but other folks can get involved from the other states. But it's not going to be like the Southeast Exotic Pest Plant Council, where there was a council in each of the states.
Right.
So we're not structuring it like that.
Okay. And it looks like she has a follow-up question, and maybe that's sort of a broader question. She asked about manual removal for cugging grass, and maybe are there some connections to some strategies, I guess, maybe that are going to be accessible from the Southeast RISC group?
So considering that coca grass is so widespread in the region, I think it would be a really good thing for us to schedule. We have a couple of folks here at University of Florida at the Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants. Stephen Enlow has worked on coca grass here in Florida and also when he was in Alabama. So as far as he has really some of the best information on how to control it. In terms of manual, from my understanding, there are ways to integrate mowing into a spray mowing, timing, like all that stuff. So I'll definitely take a note here and try to fulfill, sort of that need for information by getting someone like Stephen to present.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I realize we've come up to the top of the hour, because this is some good information with lots more questions coming in the chat. So what I would say is, if you all are game to stay on, we can keep the line open. But recognizing some folks may have to jump off. So and we can do our follow-up at the end. But are you all able to stay on for another few minutes and let questions come through, or would you rather just do follow-up later? Okay.
Yeah.
So the question is when searching for online sales of species, did you include the dark web? And is it considered that the market on the dark web is not that large, or the species are not as problematic, or do we just not know? Good question.
I was really excited to incorporate the dark web until I realized the potential legal issues I would be throwing my postdoc into by going there. It's not a nice place to send a student or a postdoc, and so I actually can't answer a question about the dark web. If I had to guesstimate, I would say it's probably less problematic. We wanted to focus on the legal trade of species because we figured that would be the highest volume of species being sold.
Yeah, that's okay, great.
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead and ask this last question here. And when it comes to modeling the propagule dispersal pressure from trade, do you think the same process could be applied to nurseries and aquatic stores for both plants and aquatic species?
That's a good idea. Yeah, we need to do that.
Well, I'll jump in here. We have a project, a plant horizon scan that Wes and I are working on. And working in collaboration with a team in Prague who are doing a lot of this like data scraping from the internet. And so they have code that they've written up where they can get mentions on Dave's Garden, mentions on, you know, for sale, Google searches, so Twitter. So we're hoping to be able to compile that information. And when we do these horizon scans, we're assessing risk. You know, risk is the likelihood something will happen and the likelihood that it will cause negative impact. So if we can incorporate that sort of propagule, like the mentions on the internet, because we already know that plants are, you know, you can buy anything on Etsy right now, including some things that technically are illegal. So we can use that as a proxy for propagule pressure in terms of, you know, our specific focus is plants and trade.
Okay, great. And I have a question about how this could, what would be required to extend this work into the US Caribbean, but we can take, because you are using, we're just now CONUS in the Southeast RISC, but the Southeast CASC footprint extends into Puerto Rico and USVI. So just would like to put that thinking in your head.
Yeah, just real quick, briefly, another project that Wes and I are getting ready, actually we have launched is we're doing a horizon scan for potential invaders to Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. We haven't determined whether we're going to incorporate climate change into this yet, but it will give us sort of a footprint in the region, and we can also use that as an opportunity. We've already recruited a few people from those islands to participate as experts for this workshop. So we can use that as a vehicle to recruit them into the RISC network as well.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you all, and thanks to those who have stayed on the line. Appreciate you guys staying a couple of minutes late and for, I mean, this really great presentation. This is obviously a huge issue for both our region and, you know, and the national CASC network. So I'm glad to have you guys lead in this charge. So yeah, real quickly, we'll just end with just to give you all a preview of what's coming up in January. And that this is going to be a series, a seminar on a project that was also a Southeast CASC funded project on facilitating the accurate and effective application of coastal marsh models. So this should be a good one coming up January 12th. 2023, hard to say that out loud already, at 11 a.m. Eastern. So please join us there. You'll be getting some more information, especially if you subscribe to our newsletter. So we'll hope you'll be able to join us. And by registering for this today, you will be added to our newsletter list, which you're welcome to unsubscribe from, but hope that you won't. And yeah, so thanks again. And for joining us today, and thanks Brett, Deah, and Wes for this great presentation and discussion. So hope you all have a great rest of your day and actually end of your year, and we'll see you all in the new one. So thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.